Welcome to episode 238 of Silver Lining for Learning. I am joined by all of my co-hosts, Lydia Kao from the University of Toronto, Yang Zhao from the University of Kansas, Punya Misha from Arizona State University, Kurt Bonk from Indiana University. And we're here because we're quite excited about EdTech Hub. Now, I had admired this organization for years because evidence is so important in making good decisions about educational technology. And because EdTech is a moving target and keeps evolving and spinning off new types of technologies, it really is a chase for researchers to try to keep up with this and to give people useful information. And we see a lot of misinformation also in EdTech. What's happening now in Gen AI is an example where, at least from my perspective as a scholar, companies are really being untruthful about what their technologies can do and what they're going to be able to do in the near future. And this is particularly important, I think, for global South countries, because the consequences of making a mistaken investment in an area with scarce resources are that you're stuck in a way that a privileged setting might be able to say, well, okay, we'll just have to reinvest in that. So EdTech Hub really plays a very important role, and we'll talk about it. So I want to invite Emil Hayat and Asad Rahman as two of our EdTech guests today. Emil, I know, is a graduate of our master's program, and she came to us knowing a lot, and she left knowing, I hope, somewhat more. Hope we were able to add to that. So Emil and then Asad, if you'll introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your role with EdTech Hub, then we'll open up the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that kind introduction, as well as for asking us to be on your podcast. We're really excited about today's episode and getting the chance to speak about some of our work because it really just kind of is a transnational organization that both works within local context but also has global expertise. My name is Amal Hayat, and I work at EdTech Hub, where our broad mission really is to support people by providing them with the evidence that they need to be able to make more informed decisions around the use of technology in education. And we work primarily within low and middle income countries. And so, as Chris mentioned, that there's a lot of misinformation around the use of EdTech. There's a lot of excitement around EdTech as well. And EdTech Hub works really along with all of those realities. And thank you for mentioning that I'm an alumni of your program, as well as I remember being in your course around emerging technologies. And I graduated in the middle of COVID pandemic, where so when I was out of that, everyone was really sort of scrambling around to figure out how to actually ensure that learning stays and continues really, both at the level of universities but also within schools. And within that context, I was really sort of keen on how do we actually have evidence and how do we make evidence informed decisions when I go back to my own country, which is Pakistan. And one of the earlier things I actually saw was there's a dearth of evidence, especially around low and middle income countries that we've seen. But EdTech Hub was working at the very start of the COVID pandemic as well. It started in 2019. And some of the earlier works that I saw was the rapid scan around the use of technology in Pakistan, which I really wanted to understand, like what the constraints were within Pakistan if you wanted to come in from an EdTech implementer's point of view. So that was my initial introduction into EdTech Hub before I had even joined the organization. And with EdTech Hub, I really love to get more into the meat of how our model really works because we generate evidence. We are a research partnership, but ultimately we also understand the limitations around simple research. We also work towards how do we actually translate that into practice. And part of that is our unique model, which is also focused on country engagement as well as innovation and bringing all of those different pieces together to be able to support decision makers most effectively. I'll give it over to Asad as well for an introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Amal, and thank you, Chris, for those kind words about EdTech Hub, the start of the show. It's really great to be here. I'm Asad, based in rainy London in the UK, and I've spent the last decade or so really deep in the trenches of funding and scaling new ideas for social change, primarily, but not actually exclusively in the education space. Right now, I work at Brink. Brink is an innovation agency, and within Brink, I lead our venturing practice. And Brink is one of the founding members of the EdTech Hub, where I've been for the last 5 years. And within the hub, my role has been experimentation lead. And that has included pioneering our sandbox offer, where we work with governments, nonprofits, EdTech organizations, and think about how to carve out a space for experimentation within education systems. So education systems are these large, complex things. And we ask, can you carve out a small space within those systems to experiment with new ideas, gather evidence systematically, rigorously, rapidly, and then think about if you discover something that works, how it can be mainstreamed back into the system as a whole. So sandboxes are they're quite common in code, where you have your main body of code, and then you have a sandbox environment where you can test new code, see if it works. If it works, you put it back into the mainstream engine. That's exactly what we're trying to do with our experimentation in sandboxes at Tech Hub. More broadly, I also think about the role of innovation approaches as complementing research approaches. So Amal will talk a bit about this, I'm sure, later, but the EdTech Hub looks to integrate traditional research with innovation in order that we right-size the evidence to the situation. So in some cases, you might want to do a large-scale research study, like an RCT. In other cases, you might just want to run small experiments and use more test, learn, and iterate approaches. So we look to combine those based on the problem at hand. And we're also increasingly seeing a demand for an interest in strategic foresight as an innovation tool and approach to complement research programs. So yeah, that's me. My background actually, before my role in the hub, wasn't in education, but much more in the world of startup, corporate innovation, and how you test, learn, and iterate to scale new ideas in the private sector. So that's the mindset that I've been bringing to the world of education and global development over the last few years.
Well, thanks to both of you. And I'm going to start off with a question, and then we'll just run from there. So one of my areas of expertise is how one scales up innovations. And what makes that tricky, particularly with technology, is conditions for success. So if you think about antibiotics, it's easy to conclude that antibiotics don't work if what you study is somebody who grinds them up and smears them all over their body, or somebody who puts a vial of antibiotics on an altar and worships it, or somebody who takes the entire bottle at once. You have to follow the instructions for the conditions for success. And yet we see all these crazy kinds of ways in which ed tech is used. I mean, what I described may sound silly for antibiotics, but there are plenty of equivalent misapplications of ed tech because people think it's magic. So when you look at research, that makes things tricky because if I do a study at a wealthy independent school in Boston and conclude that an intervention is very effective, what that masks is that it has all the conditions for success. And what happens when only some of the conditions for success are present? I imagine that that's something that you wrestle with because while you're doing your own research, which is going to be very valuable because it has the local conditions for success there, so you know. But as you look at research that supports your research or complements your research, is there a process by which you try to sort out this issue of how well that research translates to your setting.
I'm I'm happy to answer that first. I think it's an amazing question, Chris. And what's been really interesting for me coming into the education space is that there is a real strong focus on learning outcomes as when you're doing research, really like the focus of investigation being on learning outcomes, and does this intervention, does this technology create learning outcomes? And that is, of course, like really important. But something that we've been increasingly focused on in the last few years has been, how can you actually gather evidence across the whole system of factors that has to be true for an EdTech idea to have impact at scale? Because of course you can have the best intervention in the world, you can prove it generates learning outcomes in one context with one very specific set of conditions, as you say. But when you take it out of that perfect context and put it somewhere else, things in the system will change, and therefore those learning outcomes won't happen in the same way. Within our work, we use this shorthand we call the 6 Ps of the education system. And we're always looking to gather data and gather evidence in context against each of those Ps. They are the people who use the intervention or the technology, the product itself, so the EdTech idea, the pedagogical factors that are embedded in the technology, the policy environment around it, the place and the socio-cultural factors of the place that the technology is now in, and the payer, so who funds and sustains that technology over time. And when you introduce any technology into any set of conditions or into any system, we always say, can you gather data against all of these, the system of factors? Because really they all have to be working. You have to verify your assumptions in all of those aspects for something to really work. And I think your antibiotic example is a really interesting one, because you may have proven from a health perspective the antibiotic works, but if you put it in a different place where people maybe aren't used to swallowing pills, they're used to doing something else, then suddenly it doesn't work because the place has changed. So the impact isn't there. Yeah, Amal, would you add anything?
Yeah, thank you for that, Asad. I think it's a really interesting question and one we're grappling with constantly from the moment that EdTech Hub came into existence to now. And I also like to bring out the point that Asad mentioned around systems. So we understand that EdTech is not an add-on, it's not a silver bullet, but it's really a completely different way of interacting with the whole system of education in terms of, yes, learning outcomes are important, but also how's it impacting students, teachers, parents, and families, as well as educational administrators in a different way. How is it improving the way that we actually think about education? Or for example, how do we use that data to make better decisions over a period of time? How do we make better investments around the use of educational technology? And because we understand EdTech as a system, we also bring that into the way that we function as a model at EdTech Hub. Because ultimately we are a research partnership, but we're focused on all the different aspects of it as well. So the kind of research that we do is also varies drastically. So we'll have rapid evidence reviews where we're interacting with the existing evidence base, but then also building and figuring out what are the limitations of existing evidence and where we can actually come into play. We'll also generate learning briefs because we understand that a lot of decision makers don't have time to go through all of those really important research, but also usually longitudinal studies that are difficult to comprehend and difficult to immediately grasp. And then we use that system, that research system, and we bring that through our sandbox approach that Asad leads, the innovation model, where we really get into the nitty-gritty of how does implementation work with EdTech implementers before like a large rollout or a large-scale program. But that alone is not sufficient. We understand that because it's also systems, we also need to work with policymakers and practitioners at the other end of the spectrum as well, along with donor partners. So for that, we have our country engagement model that's also supported by the help desk, which offers in-time immediate response to the decision makers. And we work across 7 focus countries, as well as a number of other regions, including Southeast Asia. And one of our focus countries is Pakistan. So within our focus countries, what we mean is that we have teams that are working in the context closely with the partners to be able to translate that evidence into practice. Because a lot of the work that I do, so I work across Pakistan, Southeast Asia, as well as education and emergencies, is translate that evidence, ensure that that evidence is translated in multiple different ways for different kinds of partners that we are working with at any given point. Because ultimately, research alone doesn't work in a silo, innovation doesn't work alone in a silo, and all of them are brought together through our engagement approach. And ultimately, we call it the integrated model, which works really effectively because we have a a network of specialists with very technical expertise through our consortium partners, but then also a specialist network that's involved and embedded within the countries where we operate in.
Great. Well, you're really thinking about it systemically, which is terrific. Punya, you had a question?
Sure. So this is a little bit of a context setting question for both of you. So, Asad, for those who don't know about broadly what EdTech Hub is and does across sort of the thing, so maybe you can give us a little bit of context for like how that organization functions. And the second from Amar, from you, would love to get a little bit of context for sort of education and EdTech within the Pakistan context. So we've had guests from, from India in the past. And what happened in India is that there is just so many players within that space. So you have non-profit organizations, you have public schools, private schools, you have governments, and we've had guests from a host of these places, but I don't have much of a sense, and I'm sure others don't either, of what sort of the educational landscape looks like who you work with, and so on. So I think Asad, I'm asking you for sort of the bigger picture of EdTech Hub, and then to follow that with sort of a little more focus on the context in Pakistan, because I think most of the people who are listening to the show, I mean, myself included, wouldn't have an understanding of both of those aspects. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. No, thank you, Punya. The EdTech Hub's mission statement is to empower decision makers with the evidence to make better decisions about the role of technology in education. So that sounds very grand and big. So I'll talk a bit about what that means in practice. We, as EdTech Hub, both conduct our own research. So we're a research institute and set of partner organizations all over the world that conduct our own research. And that varies all the way from large at-scale multi-year research studies to smaller experimental approaches to working directly with governments and providing technical assistance. Sometimes I talk about it as we do evidence in, so we provide assistance to donors, funders, governments, and anyone who wants a better understanding of the evidence base as it exists right now. And we also do evidence out, so we generate our own evidence in what works when it comes to technology in education. We work in seven countries primarily, which are Sierra Leone and Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Malawi, Bangladesh, and lastly, of course, Pakistan, which Amal will talk about in a second. And we have a few major sort of methods or tools or disciplines that we apply. We apply research approaches, so traditional approaches when it comes to research. We apply innovation approaches, particularly around things like experimentation and strategic foresight, which is some of the work that I do. And to translate that research into actual change, we do country engagement. So we have people in the 7 countries looking to translate that evidence for decision makers in those countries, governments, donors, funders, EdTech organizations, nonprofits, and so on. We're fully decentralized. So we have a lot of people based in the UK and US, but also across primarily those 7 countries. And we consist of a number of partner organizations who came together to found the EdTech Hub back in 2019. So we've been going for now almost 6 years. And we're very fortunate to have funding from amazing donors, including the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Gates Foundation, UNICEF, and many others as well. And yeah, Amal, do you want to share a bit about how that looks in Pakistan specifically?
Yeah. I'll just say a bit of background into how it looks like in Pakistan. So Pakistan is one of the focus countries, and that means that we've had in-country presence since I think about 2020 when EdTech Hub really started and came to life. And so Pakistan is a decentralized education system. In some respects, it's a very challenging environment, but also very interesting one because I was working at a different sort of a role within EdTech prior to my work at EdTech Hub and prior to the COVID pandemic. I was actually designing educational technology content, so designing those learning materials from a different role. And so we've had that kind of presence for quite a while before the COVID even hit. And so there's that part of it. There's a thriving edtech ecosystem within Pakistan, but there are also what seems like insurmountable challenges, but one that we hope technology can also kind of shape part in, which are we have a really high number of out of school children, at about 26 million children out of school. We also have learning poverty for those who are within school, so they're not learning at the right level, as well as really sort of educational disruptions across the board. So COVID was just one example of it that was global, but we've also had issues around climate emergencies. Pakistan is a really at high risk country around climate, for example. And so we understand that that's part of the system, and as well as just like the political realities keep shifting as well, which adds to the challenge of working in Pakistan. There, each province and each region has a different mandate. So it feels like there's almost like many sort of things that we are actually dealing with in terms of the stakeholders. It's a very rich environment. It's a region that's also been funded, that has a lot of donor presence. So it's a great environment to work in because it's so interesting. It has like challenges around edtech, where edtech doesn't really scale beyond like the immediate implementation. So there are challenges around that, as well as how do you actually translate what we are doing into practice? There's a lot of appetite as well for evidence. We had the Global Education Monitoring Report launch a year or two ago in Pakistan, and some of the things that we heard from the stakeholders were they were very excited about how does everything that's coming out of the Global Education Monitoring Report applicable to them and how we can actually translate. So that's the key part that we play in at EdTech Hub is translating even global evidence, but also generating local evidence and ensuring that all of that comes into play through our work in Pakistan. Um, I'd also love to just kind of give a view of how we've changed in the way that we've interacted with Pakistan. So initially, when COVID hit, we were getting a lot of rapid scans and understanding the political environment of Pakistan and being engaging with the system. And over a period of time, we've had challenges like the 2022 floods that put about a third of the country underwater. And so we were developing at the time the National Distance Education Strategy with providing technical support to the federal ministry, working in partnership with provincial consultations. And what actually ended up happening in the meantime was that the 2022 floods hit, and we really needed to understand how people were using and how people could continue learning throughout those disruptions because the floods happen yearly. That's a yearly event. And so part of that we did in some of the initial research. This is one of the few earlier researches that we've done in the education and emergency space at EdTech Hub. And we were translating insights from that and bringing those along into the national distance education strategy that we developed. And so with Pakistan, we've shifted a lot in the way that we've interacted with the system to where we're now doing is the deeper engagement with not just the federal ministry, but also with provincial education departments. So that's just like an overview of the work that we've done in Pakistan and the way we've engaged with both evidence generation in Pakistan, but then also supporting that through practice by with government partners, with donor organizations, as well as the ethic implementers.
Thank you. Can I ask a quick follow-up to each of you, if you don't mind? Is that okay? My hosts, co-hosts. So Amal, can you speak a little bit through sort of I mean, I think you've spoken through sort of some of the challenges that are there, but in terms of penetration of technology, because there is also, we've had guests before who were refugees in Pakistan from Afghanistan, so you have that another layer on top of that. So and I'm doing an analogy from India, which is like there's immense linguistic diversity within India, which is one of the biggest challenges that any education thing faces is like one state to the other, it's a different language, right? So what are the sort of challenges at that level? And then Asad, maybe you can speak a little bit to what differences you are seeing between sort of culture. So I'm going back to sort of Chris's question, top point that he raised about technology being socio-technical. So do you see differences between these different countries that you work in? There are cultural differences that require you to be sensitive to ground realities or cultural context in ways that, you know, would differ between one country and the other. Does that make sense? So Amal, having you go first about sort of a little bit more about the context within Pakistan.
So thank you for that question. And for it, I think it's very simple. Like in some ways, it's very simpler because say with Pakistan, all of the provinces, even within the same province, the realities differ drastically. So we were doing consultations with different provincial education departments, understanding really how they've used and supported like climate resilience and how we're making systems resilient to climate change. And we found that there was a massive difference in the way that people would engage in terms of like bring up the challenges of working within EdTech and penetration, for example. So in regions like northern and central Punjab, for example, or even the federal region, there is much more connectivity. There are much more possibilities of this more easier environment for EdTech in some shape or form. You'll also have like really high tech equipment, like you'll have LEDs in classrooms, you'll have computers in classrooms, you'll have blended learning pilots happening. But at the same time, even within those same provinces, you'll see drastic changes because with southern Punjab, if you go just a little bit down, for example, that's where the floods are going to have more of an impact. If you were to go to KP region, there'll be landslides, regional differences. There'll also be smog and other like heat waves. There's so many variations. For Balochistan, for example, we have had partners who really sort of said that EdTech is impossible to use EdTech at all. And that's also partially why the way that they think about EdTech is also very high tech, as opposed to EdTech could be anything. It could be radio, it could be WhatsApp. And what we've seen from our work and from our research during the floods crisis in 2020, as well as the COVID pandemic, is the significant use of WhatsApp. WhatsApp is very, very accessible. And in some shape or form, teachers were using that to share lesson plans, to share videos, to share really quick questions as a way of interacting with the students. But also, it's ultimately EdTech also has like varying differences in the terms of do girls have equal access to educational technology. So you'll have a smartphone within one family, but that will usually be owned by the father of and it'll be easier for example, to give it to sons, or it'll be thought of as a device that's purely meant for entertainment. So there are always those sort of different cultural realities, and they're not consistent at all across the country. They're very different, which is why when we're working at EdTech Hub, we really tailor our approach to understanding those differences. So, for example, with our the flood research that we did, we also got context from teachers, from families on the way that they were using EdTech, but then also from development partners, because you get so much variation even between those different responses. And we understand that EdTech Hub and EdTech like interacts with entire systems, and we want to ensure that within our research, we really bring that into whether we are doing something in Pakistan or in Southeast Asia, which is or in any other region across the world.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And I think you've really laid out the complexities, you know, even within what from outside would look like one unitary structure. There's so much diversity and complexity within that. So thank you. Asad?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Punya. I think Amal has actually answered it well. I would just add two things. One is that in my experience, I think it's easy to overestimate the difference between countries and easy to underestimate actually what we call micro context. So you'll sometimes see that like rural Malawi is much more similar to rural Pakistan, and urban Pakistan is totally different to rural Pakistan. So in a way, like I think the differences between countries exist, but there's also vast kind of differences in other contextual factors that probably make more of a difference at the end of the day. And then the second thing I really understood is in the countries we work in, there are huge differences in the government budgets per child per year. And that, given our role in sandboxes is to try to mainstream EdTech. In Pakistan, for example, the government budget is roughly $200 to $300 per year per child. In the UK, it's several thousands, but in Malawi, it's less than $100 per year per child. And so the absorptive capacity of public education systems really, really varies. And that really shifts what's possible and what we test. So I think that's also a big difference within like between
Yeah,
countries.
thank you very much, both of you. And Asad, I really love that thing that you talked about, that the within country difference versus between. I think that's such a critical point. I think there's this wonderful TED talk. I don't remember the name of the gentleman who did it, where he does this sort of data and he breaks down nations by clusters and shows how within, like, let's say Vietnam, I think he gives the example of Vietnam, you have actually 5 different Vietnams. And to talk about Vietnam as being one country
Right.
actually misses the complexity of sort of if you want to address challenges or so on. So thank you for that. So I know I could go on and on, but I know my other hosts are waiting. I think Lydia, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Punya.
Go ahead.
I'm really fascinated by this notion of a sandbox. I wonder if we can unpack that a little bit more for our listeners, like perhaps give us 1 or 2 examples of innovations within the sandbox. And also I'm curious, you talk about making EdTech mainstream, like what happens after the sandbox? Can you give us an example how you translate this innovation from the sandbox outside? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lydia. I'd love to give some examples. So maybe I'll give the example of our sandbox in Pakistan first. So we, at the outset of COVID, which, as everyone here knows, led to many children suddenly out of school, did a range of sandboxes with grassroots nonprofit organizations, looking at how they could pivot to using EdTech more effectively. And one of the organizations we worked with was a grassroots organization in Pakistan called DeafReach, who provide schools and educational interventions for deaf learners in Pakistan. And they had never used technology before. And suddenly, during the pandemic, all of their learners were out of their schools. So having to learn at home. And for deaf learners at home, often learning at home is impossible because they'll be the only people in their families who can understand Pakistani Sign Language. It simply wouldn't be possible like it would be for non-deaf learners for them to learn at home with their parents. And so we worked with DeafReach to create videos for learners at home and did a whole host of small experiments to see if those videos at home would lead to those deaf learners actually learning effectively. For example, we worked with 200 learners, introduced those videos and looked at worksheet scores before and after. We took 100 of those learners and had them talk to teachers twice a week to see if that had more of an impact as opposed to just consuming the videos. We worked with teachers to produce different kinds of videos to see what type of video, what length of video produced the most effective outcomes. And through the process of doing experiments on a cycle of roughly every 6 weeks, we got to a point where DeafReach understood how those videos might work for learners at home. And what was probably the most interesting thing for me was they also experimented with how they could scale that across different contexts through franchising and replication. So DeafReach, through this process, learned about what it takes to produce videos for deaf learners. And then they worked with other nonprofits, including one in Palestine and one in Nigeria, to teach and provide expertise to those nonprofits so that they could produce videos for deaf learners in their own contexts. So scaling through a franchising and replication model. And that really is the aim of a sandbox. It's testing through rapid cycles of experimentation, iteration, what works, and then looking to create a pathway to scale for that. The example that I've just given sort of shows our work with a nonprofit. Other sandboxes we've done work much more closely with governments who have an idea as to how EdTech might form a part of their budgets and their systems and their processes in sort of public education. For example, we worked in Bangladesh to understand the role of projectors and projectors as part of the public education system by testing them in rural contexts, again, using experimentation and learning. So yeah, that's just I guess an insight into what what it looks like under the bonnet. We've done around 15 sandboxes over the last 5 years across our focus countries, and they've all been slightly different, but some of those themes have been constant.
Thank you. I'll just add a different, I think, perspective to the sandbox approach and in a different direction almost. As at least the sandbox, and for me, I think what's interesting to me is how we've because like we are organized the way that we have different expertise within the hub itself. There's a lot of cross-cultural learning happening even within our specialists and our technical experts as well. And some of the things that he pointed out with the sandbox approach was actually like how we even translate that and bring that and apply it to different situations that might work in a different context in a different country, which goes back to Asad's point around there might be similarities in rural Marawi and rural Pakistan, for example, because sometimes they're not that different. I was looking at a video the other day with of infrastructural damage in New York subways. And immediately at this, we also have the monsoon season in Pakistan right now, and it was very similar to the videos that were coming out. So there's so much that's similar across different cultures. And at Tech Hub, I think that what's really interesting about the way that we approach our model, which is really unique, is the way that we can connect those different dots across different cultures and across different countries.
Thank you so much, Asad and Mal. I think I'm going to pass this to Kurt.
Okay, I have two clarification questions before I get to my deeper question. You listed and you mentioned 7 countries, but I only was able to jot down 6: Sierra Leone, Ghana, Tanzania, Malawi, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. I couldn't write fast enough. What's the 7th country? What am I missing?
I think
yeah.
Kenya is missing, I think, if I
Yeah.
remember your list correctly.
Okay.
But
So those 7 countries are your focus countries. Do you have additional countries that you're working with tangentially, or can you give us a sense of how many in total have utilized the hub over time? And then I'll get to my real question.
So thank you so much for that question because we have 7 focus countries, but we're not limited in the way that we work to those 7 focus countries. What that means really is that we have in-country presence as well, and we work closely with the partners there. So for really sort of deep contextual work over a period of time for a long-term approach to thinking about different systems, like in Pakistan, for example. And I can also get into more of that a little bit, but just to broaden the scope, we also work in other regions. So, for example, we're working in Southeast Asia, where we've partnered with the SEMIO Secretariat under the ASEAN UK SAGE program, are supporting the advancement of girls' education. And we've recently, a couple of months ago, we developed out-of-school children's scoping study across 11 countries in the ASEAN region with that support in the ASEAN UK SAGE program. And so we're working in partnership there as well, Southeast Asia, and through our help desk approach, which is part of our country engagement and technical assistance model, we can really sort of, people can approach us through different organizations who are funding partners, and we can tailor that kind of support. For example, if they need a rapid evidence review, if they need like a curated list of what kind of edtech tools can support them, to even longer term assistance, like, for example, developing a national business education strategy, which we've done in Sierra Leone more recently, like we did earlier in Pakistan and in Cambodia as well. So it's not really tied to, it's both across our focus countries, but also extended because we've had support and we've supported work in Ukraine as well, because education in emergencies is another of our more newer focus areas within the EdTech Hub, because we work in regions, but then also different ways of supporting, both in terms of developing that system resilient over a period of time, because emergencies are unfortunately our reality, not just in low and middle income countries, but even in higher income settings as well. So we're really looking forward to developing that system resilience. And part of that is also about emerging technologies like the use of AI. But I hope that answered your question.
Sure. And if Asad has additional information, maybe he can add that to it in my actual real question coming up here. We have listeners viewers of Silver Lining for Learning who are students, who are professors, who are administrators in K-12 schools, who are consultants, who are researchers, who are just plain interested in what we have on the show for the coming week. I wonder if each of you could give one or two examples of use, specific examples, or testimonials that you've heard from teachers or students or professors or administrators or politicians about EdTech Hub. So we get some reality check here, some authenticity. How are people utilizing it? What are you hearing from people out there in the 7 focus countries? And by the way, we are Silver Lining for Learning, so look at the optimistic side here. Success. What successes have you heard?
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that I've had the total joy of doing in the last year with EdTech Hub is creating and running a course for EdTech entrepreneurs. We have had 100 entrepreneurs all across sub-Saharan Africa take part in this course, which took place over 12 weeks and was cohort-based. And we really wanted in that course to equip those entrepreneurs with the best evidence so they could build their product based on what the world already knows about how EdTech works, when it doesn't work. And in terms of testimonials, one of the things that really stood out to me was one of our entrepreneurs from Kenya. He's called Kiko. He runs a startup that's scaling. It's about like 30 people. It's called Ngaza Elimu. And he said there's a real difference, night and day difference between his product before he did the course and his product after he did the course. And for me, I think entrepreneurs are a really, really interesting audience for the EdTech Hub, because these are often the people who are building EdTech bottom up and far, far too busy building to engage with academic literature and evidence in the way it's traditionally disseminated. And it is these bottom-up entrepreneurs who I think are one of the most powerful agents of change when it comes to technology is truly transforming learning outcomes. But often they build EdTech from a very tech-first perspective rather than evidence-first perspective or a user-first perspective. So yeah, maybe that's a bit of a long answer to your question, Kurt, but it's the testimonial that's really stayed with me because it really sits central to our mission of giving people the evidence and tools to build EdTech and implement EdTech in a more informed way and make better decisions. Amal, I don't know, is there anything that sticks out to you in your...
Yeah, I think I'll take a different sort of approach. I was just thinking of agents of change that you mentioned. And quite often when we're dealing with EdTech Hub, we're not directly impacting in that shape of form. We're not directly constantly always interacting with teachers and students, but that is ultimately our end users, our teachers and students and families. And quite often it might feel like we have like the focus on EdTech implementers or with the political aims as well, is that gets lost sometimes in the middle, the actual end users that we are trying to affect. And I think that for me at least, what felt very sort of, I always love interacting with teachers or students and getting to hear from them, because ultimately whatever we are doing is in service of their needs really, because they're ultimately the agents of change. They're the ones that are impacted the most and the ones that really we need their buy-in as well. And so we were actually doing a research study that you can, one of the, that we are also really excited about that just came out around the use of AI-generated lesson plans. And we were interacting with teachers as well as administrators around their initial perceptions around the lesson plans themselves. And what for me really came out as interesting insight was the way that how we are sort of taking what teachers are learning and their experiences, and we are translating it back to the policymakers, to the implementers who have more of a role in directly changing the way that they interact with the system. So we are taking information from them and we're hearing and really trying to listen to what they're saying and their needs, and then translating it back to the implementers as well as the policymakers so that they can then make a change and improve and iterate around their implementation. So for me, that sort of they're just the perspective of being heard around what their concerns were and what their realities were was really sort of, I think, eye-opening. So that's a different way to answer your question, I think, is
Thank
that
you.
we're also interacting ultimately. That's what we're working towards and what we're hoping to hear from.
Both wonderful answers, and we move on to Young for his questions.
Well, thank you very much. I have so many questions like Punya, but I'm going to go one direction instead of the other. Chris mentioned something really important about the transferability of research. What you might be missing in these countries versus the abundance of research coming out from the US and China right now. I think the cultural context, linguistic context, financial context, all different. And that's one thing. Another thing, I think when Punya asked question, I think Asad mentioned about budget. They don't really have a lot of money. That's one big thing, right? So my question really has a lot to do with why do they trust you? Because in education research, we know educational research has not had much impact on policy or practice in general. And there are problems, God, in EdTech might be one of the fields that has the largest number of publications. There are hundreds of thousands of articles come out of new. And you guys look very young, at least younger than Chris, me, and Kurt, and not Lydia. And you're very young. Like, why do they trust you? What are the difficulties of convincing people to spend their $100 on technology, or there may be $5 on technology? So can you just share with us, our audience are from policymakers, teachers, graduate students, so they might learn, how do you really try to make an impact in these countries? Another question related to that, how do you know you're giving them good, actually research? How do you know you're advising them in the right direction? Because I'm very worried. Whenever I give advice to people who have spent, a lot of their money on something, and I become very nervous. And so those two questions, Amal and Asad, any of you or both of you, just feel free, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful question, and really kind of at the heart of the work that we do. Because ultimately, if we want to ensure that evidence doesn't just stay on a dusty shelf somewhere, is to actually build those relationships, build trust with the right people at the right time, and also so that they can trust us with the evidence as well. And I think it's a really complex problem. And the way that we actually go about it is that the way that we work, we are lucky because like people are already interested in EdTech in some shape or form. Sometimes a little too interested to the point where it's very, very optimistic without the guardrails that you really need. And what really helps us is both because we're working within context. So, for example, it's always interesting when they see someone from Pakistan who's talking about these things. So there'll be some level of trust, but there'll also be trust building that really needs to come. And we always come from a place where we want to understand what their needs are. What are the problems that they're concerned about? What are their priorities? Because the priorities shift drastically, even within the same ministry, just between different stakeholders. And so we don't really come in from there's a one solution that is going to solve all of your needs. We really understand first and seek to understand first what their realities are. And a lot of the time when people are heard about what their problems are, there's a level of trust that's already being built at the back of everything that we're doing. And then also what we're supported with is our global expertise, our global consortium partners as well. So they're always interested in listening. Okay, for example, we want to implement like these learning management system in Pakistan. What insights are you learning from across the globe that might be applicable to our Pakistani context? And so we are able to translate certain insights because it's not a one size fits all model, but we can sometimes extract learnings from one place and then suggest different possible solutions because we are ultimately working with them step by step to be able to get that. And that's usually what helps with that trust building. And that's always an ongoing work because over the period of like past 4 or 5 years, we've developed relationships with multiple partners, both locally as well as globally. And at this point, they're all sort of coming together in fascinating ways. And that also leads to increased trust because we know that person and they also know this. And so there's an amount of respect that comes with it. So it becomes easier, but it's a long-term process, and we are always constantly working and learning and seeking to learn and then providing them with the support that they need. To answer your question, I hope that's thank you so much for the question, though.
Thank you, Amal. Asad?
Yeah, I just want to underline Amal's point about EdTech Hub from 2019, from our founding, has had these focus countries and had people in those focus countries. And I think they would all say it took between 3 to 5 years to get a seat at the table in the conversations that matter in those countries. And so just being there, sticking around, and showing that you were invested in part of the ecosystem and contributing to the ecosystem over many years, I think has served us very well to get now 6 years into our journey, a seat at the table in conversations and decisions around EdTech. I also want to pick up, Young, on your point that I totally agree. There is a big gulf between the creators of evidence and the users of evidence, in that evidence gets created in often in like academic contexts. And then there's a big gulf between those contexts and the context of use, where it gets used by governments to make policy decisions or by builders to make design decisions about their products. And one of the ways we think about reducing that gulf is to equip people within governments or people within the nonprofits who often implement EdTech to conduct research themselves. And often one of the ways we measure success in our projects is for people who didn't think of themselves as researchers before we started to now be able to apply, not in the most rigorous way, but with just enough rigor, a mindset around evidence that means they can generate evidence themselves. They can think about programs that they develop and investments they make in terms of, are we learning and generating evidence through this work that we can apply back into our decisions? So turning people into researchers is also part of our mandate, and I think helps us because it means they don't have to trust us because they're generating the evidence themselves, and then they can trust their own evidence. So that's an approach that's served us well as well. The last few
If I may, I just want to add one more point. We don't have time for you to answer a question because Chris has another one. One of the things about these countries or other developing countries is, one model we always want them to do is to follow the Western established education, right? We build schools, we do this. But we also know Western countries are trying to break down their education system, to undo their education system. So here's just an interview you may want to read. I just did this for EdTech Digest. And so I was just wondering, in your sandbox, and are you really rethinking about possibly changing the model of education instead of like building schools, building this, building that? Are we really trying to undo education? And here's a bunch of articles recently I wrote about education, AI, and transformation. It's basically, can we redo this? But you don't have to answer a question, just to think about inventing the future rather than copying the past. So, Chris, go ahead. I don't want to, I want to make sure we hear Chris.
Well, as always, we have much more to talk about than we have time, and it would be great. Maybe we should do a future episode that really centers on this sort of tension between upgrading and rethinking. I think that would be fun.
Perhaps, Chris, I sound like say in 2 sentences, I guess our response to that, because it's a really interesting question, and I think there's a tension when we talk about, Young, in the way you said there, like disrupting the system. We very much see ourselves as sandboxing approaches that can mainstream into that system, but taking that system as something that is relatively inflexible. So I guess maybe that's a valid challenge to us, because I don't think we think like that at all right now. I think we very much think of, there is an education system, and we need EdTech ultimately that can play a role within it rather than upend it or disrupt it. So it's an interesting provocation. Yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes, but I did want to bring up a theme that we often have in our Silver Lining for Learning episodes, and that is the difference between a brand like EdTech Hub and a model. So we may have listeners to the program today who are saying, I'd like to do something similar in my region of the world. Maybe hypothetically, there are listeners saying, I'd like to create the equivalent of an EdTech hub that would focus in Central and South America. So you have a brand that's also a very desirable model. It's persisted, it's cross-country, it's making a substantial impact. If somebody were listening, what advice would you have for them if they wanted to do a similar kind of model about evidence and educational technology in a different part of the world? Any quick thoughts from both of you about what kind of advice you might have?
Thank you for that, Chris. I think so. EdTech, the unique thing about EdTech Hub is it's both very super contextual, but at the same time, it's global. We started out with like the focus countries, and the focus countries were originally at the time that I joined the hub, we had 6 focus countries. So we'd extended into Malawi at that point to make them 7 focus countries. And then as time went along, we also extended into Southeast Asian region. So we've also talked about a little bit about the help desk model, which we can't really get into the depths of because there's so much to discuss. But in some respects, I think that EdTech Hub already does that global aspect to it because we're not tied to one region. We're always open to different partnerships across different cultures and across different countries, as well as recently we've also stepped into partnership with IDRC in going into that sort of future ready systems because we have climate and education and emergencies coming up, as well as emerging technology and the promise that they bring. With AI. And I think I leave just because we only 1 or 2 minutes, I leave it for Asad as well to talk a little bit more. I think if he wants to about the recent partnerships that we're developing and how we're expanding, essentially.
Your question is a really good one, Chris, around what advice I would give. I mean, EdTech Hub was founded in 2019, and we're in a very different climate now when it comes to global development, when it comes to the world, international relations. And so I don't know if the model that we were founded on and the climate in which we were founded, whether you can transfer those conditions to the conditions we're in now. And the thing that I am increasingly sure of is that we still have a global learning crisis. It's more persistent than ever. And it's really bottom-up change through experimentation, learning, and iteration, rather than top-down, large-scale funding that's gonna shift that. And so to anyone who's kind of interested in this work, interested in these ideas, interested in evidence as a lever for change, I would really just encourage them to get out, start experimenting with ideas, and think about what's the sort of smallest amount of evidence you need to make the next decision, and then keep going from there. Yeah.
Well, those are very thoughtful answers, and again, a lot of food for thought, and continuing these themes in our future episodes. So I want to thank both of you for making the time. The work you're doing is really important and really complex, as we've discussed. And we're happy to celebrate you and hope that you, if we can be of help, that you will call on us. Kurt, do you want to say something about what we'll be doing a week from now?
I sure do, but I wonder if Punya, Lydia, or Young have a final comment?
No, I just wanted to thank both of you for joining us and for the work that you do. And I'm glad to be a part of this conversation.
No, thank you for the opportunity. And we loved being here.
We loved having you. Next week is an 11 a.m. Eastern Time show. It's episode 239. We'll hear from John Traxler, who's the former mobile learning chair in the UK, along with he's at Wolverhampton University and other things. He's also chair of the Commonwealth of Learning too. Helen Crompton, who's a former elementary teacher in the UK and friends with John. Now she is a mobile learning expert and AI and education expert at Old Dominion University in the United States. And Mike Sharples, who was on our show 4 years ago talking about learning at scale. He's emeritus professor of the Open University and also is a mobile learning expert. The three of them will talk about mobile learning and generative AI for the less privileged refugees and the global South. So we hope to see you then. Thank you.